G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. In this session, we will be starting the book of Hosea. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Tonight, we're looking at the book of Hosea, and we'll be doing chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 13. Now, last session, we finished off the book of Jonah. And remember, in the first few verses, we saw there that Jonah prayed 3 prayers. First of all, when he got thrown into the water, he was bobbing around in the water, and he prayed to God while he was alive, floating in the water. Then he drowned. He went down to the bottom of the ocean, into the mountains down there, covered by the weeds. And we see that his spirit entered into Sheol. His body was then swallowed by the fish, and so he was preserved. His body was preserved. And out of the belly of Sheol, he cried. It was his second prayer, and he prayed to be delivered out of his state of disobedience. Resurrection took place while his body was still in the fish, and his third prayer was out of the belly of this great fish. And Jonah will now be able to complete his commission and go to Nineveh. And the fish was very helpful in that he spat him out on dry land. And so Jonah arose and he went to Nineveh, and according to the word of God, he went there and he preached immediately upon entering the city. And his message was 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And that was going to be overthrown the same way that Sodom and Gomorrah was overthrown. And what we saw was the entire strata of society, from the richest to the poorest, from the greatest to the least, went into mourning. The entire city then turned to God, and judgment was averted. And that taught us that repentance averts judgment. And then Jonah wasn't very happy with this outcome, because Jonah had had a tremendous, even though he's had this wonderful evangelical success, in excess of 120,000 people turning to Jesus Christ through his preaching, he was actually exceedingly angry at God's ability to preserve. Jonah did not wish to see Nineveh repent and be spared, because he knew from the preaching of Amos, the prophet that was previous to him, that Nineveh was going to come and destroy Israel. Now, Jonah expresses his desire to die, and instead of putting him to death, Jehovah God asked him a question in light of when the question was, in light of the grace that was extended to him, actually bringing him back to life. God asked, do you really have a good cause to be angry? And Jonah here, he didn't answer that. Instead he builds a booth where he could actually sit under the shade of this booth and look into Nineveh to see whether, perhaps they're going to sin and perhaps God will wipe them out, but not so. And so God teaches him a lesson there. And what God does is that he allows a gourd, a plant, to grow up, and to provide shade for Jonah. And it delivered him from his depression, because he was so happy that he had this shade from this tree. But then that night a worm came along, destroyed the tree. And the next day the scorching wind brought by God beat against him. Jonah gets sunstroke. And his depression returned. And again, he made a second request to die. He's now angry at God's ability to destroy. He's so angry, and he says, I have a right to be angry, that I want to die, he says. So what the lesson that God taught him was that, Jonah was now more concerned about the death of the gourd than he actually was about the 120,000 people in Nineveh. And God's concern was for the people for whom both God and Jonah labored. The Bible doesn't tell us what Jonah's response to that was, but we do know that obviously he wrote the book, therefore he must have responded in the affirmative. What we did learn from that was God's willingness to save Gentiles, because remember, Nineveh were Gentiles. And also the principle of the delay of judgment. And what we saw also, that God will not cast aside because of faithlessness, in the case of Jonah, for instance. And we also saw the nature of ministry. In anyone's ministry, the results may not be what you expect, good or bad. God is responsible for the results. The individual just does what he's called to do. And our responsibility is faithfulness. And then another thing we learned out of the book of Jonah was that before you react to the grace given to another believer, remember the grace that is given to you. Okay, so that was just a recap on the last session of Jonah. Now we're moving into the new prophet, which is Hosea. Hosea. Okay, I've given you an outline of the book of Hosea there, and it's broken up into two main sections. We have the message of Hosea's marriage in 1:2 to 3:5. We have the message of Hosea's prophecies in 4:1 to 14:18, and then we just have capping it off. We just have the conclusion. Now, Hosea in chapter 1, verse 1, what we have here is the introduction to Hosea. The word of Jehovah that came unto Hosea the son of Beeri in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Yeah, the name we see here, the name is Hosea. In Hebrew, it's almost the same. It's actually Hosea. We just have an SH. The name actually means salvation. It comes from the same root word as the words for Joshua or Yeshua, Isaiah. All of them came from this root word, which means to save. His family, as far as his family, he tells us that he's the son of Beeri, which means my well. And that's all we know. That one basic fact of who his father was. We don't know anything else about his family except his own marital problems, which we're going to see in the first 3 chapters of his book. Hosea is fairly easy to date because he does tell us who the kings were during his prophecies. He lived through 4 kings of Judah. We had Uzziah, which was 790 to 737, Jotham, 739 to 735, Ahaz, 735 to 715, and Hezekiah, 715 to 686. So that was the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom. He only mentions one king of Israel, and that is Jeroboam II, who ruled from 781 to 735 BC. However, we know from the king of Judah list that we just looked at that there were other kings of Israel that he ministered under, and those were King Zechariah, who ruled for a very short time, in 753, very short indeed. Then we had Shalom in 752, Menahem in 752 to 741, Pekahiah 741 to 739, Pekah 739 to 731, and the last king was Hosea 731 to 722 BC. And this king of Israel had the same name as this prophet. They're both in Hebrew, Hosea. So don't confuse Hosea the king with Hosea the prophet. Now, based on all these facts, the prophecies of Hosea came somewhere between the year 790 to 722 BC. And that's in the shortest span. That's a span of about 68 years. In the wider span, his prophecies span between 70 and up to 100 years. Now, what does it all mean? Well, what it means is that, remember, he is the prophet of the northern kingdom, Israel. So he would have been living when his kingdom was destroyed. He would have been living when the Assyrians came and smashed Israel. Now, remember, we're doing these minor prophets in their chronological order. So he is actually a successor to Amos the prophet, and he's also a contemporary of 2 other prophets. One of them is Micah and Isaiah. But Micah and Isaiah were down south in Judah, while Hosea was up north in Israel. Now, where about? Well, we know that he is a prophet of the northern kingdom, Israel. That's where he's located. And that's why throughout his book, his primary concern is with Israel and not with Judah. He does, give a couple of side warnings to Judah, but his primary concern is Israel. And we know it was Israel, not only because that was his primary concern, but we're going to see in chapter 7, verse 5, he refers to the ruler of Samaria as our king, Hosea's king, and now Samaria is part of the northern kingdom. Hosea is also unique in that he is the only prophet to the northern kingdom who was actually from the northern kingdom. Amos was a prophet to the northern kingdom, but where did he come from? He came from the southern kingdom, because remember, Amaziah says to him, yeah, go back to your own land, go back to Judah and leave us alone up here. And Jonah, well, Jonah was from the north, but he was actually sent to Nineveh. So as far as the writing prophets, he is the only prophet to the northern kingdom that was also from the northern kingdom. Now, what's the historical setting? Well, at this point, the Assyrian Empire was rising to even greater power than it was under Amos. And because he also prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam II in the north, it was a time of outward prosperity until those two kings died. And again, these two kingdoms under Uzziah and Jeroboam II extended their borders to the boundaries of what King David and King Solomon had. So at the time that Hosea is prophesying, the social picture and the economic picture and the political picture for Israel was quite healthy. But when Jeroboam II died during Hosea's prophecies, the northern kingdom was followed by a long period of royal assassinations. So on the death of Jeroboam II, the royal assassinations were one after another, and often the kingdom was actually ruled by military rule. So the political picture actually moved from stability to instability. It was stable under Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom, and suddenly it was unstable as one king who came on the scene was assassinated, followed by the next king who was assassinated. It was a very dangerous era to be a king. And the religious picture was bleak from day one. Because remember, it was first of all the worship of the Canaanite god Baal and the worship of the they were still worshiping the golden calf. And that was set up when the kingdom was first divided. Remember, Jeroboam I, he was the one who instituted the golden calf worship. Now, the worship of the golden calf was a corruption of the true worship. Now, why do we say that? Well, because the golden calf was a pseudo-Jehovah religion. It was not an introduction of a new religion, but it was a corruption of the old religion, the true religion. And they refer to the golden calf as the God that brought Israel out of Egypt. Now, we know the God who did that was Jehovah. And so they refer to the golden calf as that God. So it was a pseudo-Jehovah religion. Now, the worship of the golden calf was bad because it was a corruption of the true. But even worse, the other system, the worship of Baal, was a false religion outright. And furthermore, idolatry was now widespread in the northern kingdom. And with idolatry, immorality was widespread since the worship of Baal included temple prostitution. So not only was the political picture bad and the religious picture bad, but we see also that the social picture was also bad, because Hosea is going to mention the social problems, which included murder and bloodshed, robbery. And in fact, he will make reference to gangs, and these gangs were actually Levites, Levitical priests, forming gangs to rob people. And then we had adultery, oppression, pride. These were all part of the social picture that Hosea was faced with. And so Hosea was now sent by God to prophesy to a doomed nation. It was a nation already sentenced to destruction. It was already decreed as such by Amos. And now Hosea is now going to reaffirm that. The major points that we find in the book of Hosea will be, first up, the sins of Israel. And we're going to see that Israel's lack of knowledge, and because of her lack of knowledge, she is destined for destruction. And then we're going to see the judgment of God for her sin. But Hosea is going to point out that God still loves Israel irregards. And he'll also prophesy Israel's ultimate salvation. And we're also going to see the bill of divorcement. It will be a major point within Hosea's book. The theme of Hosea, well, the theme of the book is God's love for Israel. In spite of everything that Hosea says, God still loves Israel. To this day, God still loves Israel. Now, in the New Testament, we see that there are 5 parts of Hosea which are quoted, and some parts are quoted more than once. Hosea 2, verse 23, along with Hosea 1, verse 10, is quoted in Romans 9, 25 to 26, and 1 Peter 2:10. Hosea 6:6 is quoted by Matthew 9:13, Matthew 12:7, and Mark 12:33. Hosea 11:1 is quoted by Matthew 2:15. Hosea 10:8 is quoted by Luke 23:30 and Revelation 6:16. Hosea 13:14 is quoted by 1 Corinthians 15, verse 55. In verse 1, we're told that the word of Jehovah came onto Hosea. And the Hebrew construction means to take possession of Hosea. So the word of Jehovah took possession of Hosea. And by doing that, it resulted in prophetic utterance and the writing of this inspired text. And as I said before, this book divides very nicely into 2 major segments. First is the message of Hosea's marriage in 1 verse 2 to 3 verse 5. And the second is the message of Hosea's prophecies in 4 verse 1 to 14 verse 8. And many of his messages in this second segment are based upon his experiences in chapters 1 to 3. Okay, so the message of Hosea's marriage. This is the first major section, and this goes from chapter 1, verse 2 to chapter 3, verse 5. And we're going to see here the first commission to Hosea in chapter 1, verse 2 to chapter 2, verse 1. And we're going to see him now with the wife and children in chapter 1, verses 2 to 9. When Jehovah spake at the first by Hosea, Jehovah said unto Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom. For the land doth commit great whoredom, departing from Jehovah. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bare him a son. And Jehovah said unto him, Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause the kingdom of the house of Israel to cease. And it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 6. And she conceived again and bare a daughter. And Jehovah said unto him, Call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, that I should in any wise pardon them. But I'll have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by Jehovah their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Jehovah said, Call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. So here in chapter 1, verse 2 to chapter 2, verse 1, we're given his first commission, and it concerns in verses 2 to 9, the wife and children. He begins with the wife in verse 2, and the first part of verse 3 with the commission beginning in verse 2. And what he says, when Jehovah spake at the first. In other words, what we're seeing here is this is the first time that Hosea received any prophetic revelation, the first message he ever received from God as a prophet. It was a very strange way, as we will see, to begin a prophetic ministry. But at the very beginning of his prophetic ministry, he was now asked to marry a wife of whoredom. In other words, he was asked to marry a prostitute. Now, in some circles, and in fact, many of the commentaries I looked at, they try to allegorize this away, that she was not a physical prostitute, just a spiritual prostitute, because God would not violate his own law and ask a prophet to marry a prostitute. But under the Mosaic law, marrying a prostitute was only forbidden for a priest. And we can find it in Leviticus 2, verse 17 and Leviticus 14, Leviticus 21, verse 7 and verse 14. And it was only for the priesthood, it was only for the Levites, and not for any other member of any other tribes. And now we know that when God asked Hosea to marry a prostitute, he was not violating any Mosaic commandment at all. And God sometimes does ask prophets to do some very strange things. If you ever read through Isaiah was asked to walk naked for several years. Jeremiah was asked to take a very long trip up north just to bury something and then to go back and unbury it. So God asked the prophets to do some very strange things, because often what a prophet did visually was going to be a picture for the nation. And this is what we're seeing here. Hosea was asked to be a prophet, not only a prophet that would prophesy what he receives from God to the nation, but he had to now live out a very specific role that is going to illustrate to Israel God's relationship to Israel. Now, in essence, what God was asking Hosea to do from the very first day of his marriage was to have an unhappy one. He was commanded to have an unhappy marriage, because the relationship of Hosea to his wife is going to be a picture lesson of God's relationship to his wife. And Israel is the wife of Jehovah. So Hosea must now go and marry a prostitute. And he also says, take the children of whoredom. So in other words, the children she's already had because of her previous prostitution, he is to adopt. And so children are to be adopted that were already born as a result of her prostitution. And immediately, God tells Hosea that his life is going to be a picture lesson. And the application is clearly for the nation. As we see at the end of verse 2, for the land doth commit a great whoredom, departing from Jehovah. So in this application we're seeing here, Hosea's wife is going to represent the nation of Israel, while his children are to stand for individuals within the nation. Now, this should be taken as a literal event. Hosea really was asked by God to marry a prostitute, which he actually did, and he also did adopt her children. And then, on top of that, he now had children of his own by her. On the other hand, what he literally did was he carried a pictorial application and lessons for his nation as a whole. Remember, his nation is the northern kingdom, Israel. And being a prophet of God, Hosea, in spite of his personal feelings, he obeys God. He marries a woman named Gomer, and the name of Gomer means perfection or completion. She's a daughter of Diblaim, and Diblaim means double fig cakes. Now, to us it might mean a lot, but fig cakes in the ancient world was an erotic symbol. It was a symbol of erotica. And so if you put the two names together, it means that she was a perfect daughter of pleasure. It was a sensual pleasure. Now, in addition to the children he had to adopt, he eventually had his own children, and these are mentioned from verses 3 to 9. His first child in verses 3 to 5 was a son, and God commanded that that son be called Jezreel, just like the valley of Jezreel. Jezreel is his name. Now, the Hebrew word for Jezreel can have two meanings. It could mean either God scatters. It could also mean God sows, S-O-W-S. And in fact, what we're going to see here is that both meanings are going to come out in Hosea. Initially, God is going to scatter, but eventually he will again sow. But for now, the reason the son is to be named Jezreel is because of the application the text now gives. He says, I will avenge, this is God saying, I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. Now, Jehu was the one who destroyed the entire house of Ahab. He destroyed the entire dynasty of Ahab. And much of this was done in the city of Jezreel, which is in the valley of Jezreel. However, why would God avenge such an action? Because he did command it. He commanded Jehu to go north and to destroy the house of Ahab. Now, the reason God now avenges on the house of Jehu what Jehu did to the house of Ahab is because Jehu, while he obeyed God, he did it from an improper motivation. What do I mean? Well, his motive was not simply to obey God, and his motive was not to obey God and to reestablish Jehovah worship. While he did do away with the worship of Baal, because that's Jezebel with her Baal, he reinstituted the worship of the golden calf. And the reason Jehu destroyed the house of Ahab was not obedience to God, but it was to gain full political power without any challenges, and that was an improper motivation. Some people obey God out of an improper motivation, and Jehu is a very good example here. Now, the historical account where these things are recorded, we can find them in 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10. And the fulfillment of this prophecy on the house of Jehu, you can see that in 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 8 to 12. The house of Jehu fell around about 752 BC when one of the kings of the house of Jehu, Zechariah, was killed. And the result of this whoredom that we're seeing here was, I will cause the kingdom of the house of Israel to cease. And that was fulfilled in 722 to 721 BC. In verse 5, it says, and it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And the result of it, he says, is that I will break the bow in the valley. Now, to break the bow means it's a breakup of the kingdom. The kingdom is going to fall. This is the northern kingdom is going to fall. And it's going to happen in the valley of Jezreel, which is a place where it will be broken up. By the way, Jezreel, the valley of Jezreel is where Christians today call the valley of Armageddon. That's what the Christian name for the valley, but the Bible never gives the valley that name. That's just tradition, Christian tradition today. The biblical Armageddon, which means the mountain of Megiddo, refers to one mount at the western end of the valley, which is Mount Megiddo, on which the city of Megiddo sat. The word Armageddon in the Bible does not apply to the valley. That's just a modern Christian term for the valley. The biblical name is always the valley of Jezreel. And that's where the breakup of the nation Israel is going to happen. And in the Hebrew text here, we see that there's a bit of a play upon words. It doesn't come out in English all that well, because in Hebrew, the word Israel is pronounced Yisrael, and Jezreel in Hebrew is pronounced Yisrael. And there's a play upon words because the only change is from an S in Yisrael to Yisrael in the word for Jezreel. And that's the play upon the words in this verse. Now, the result of this fall is that there will be a scattering. And here we have one of the two meanings of the word Jezreel, God scatters. So this becomes a reversal of another one of the judges, Gideon. Gideon had a victory in the same place, mentioned in Judges 6:33 to 7:23. And this prophecy regarding Israel here was fulfilled when the Assyrians captured Galilee, in which the Jezreel is found. And we see that in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. Now, in verses 6 to 7, we see that Gomer, they have a second child, this time a daughter. And God says, name her Lo Ruhama, which means no mercy. And the application is there will be no mercy for Israel. I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel. Now, I mentioned just quickly before that he makes a couple of side comments about Judah. Here's one of the side comments here in verse 7. It says, he will still extend mercy to Judah because Judah has been more faithful, and Judah will be spared the Assyrian destruction. Although Assyria will invade Judah, Assyria will not succeed in destroying Judah, only in destroying Israel. Now notice here that God is the speaker, and God says, I will save them by Jehovah their God. So here's one of those two examples in the Old Testament where we have two personalities in the same verse named Jehovah. Jehovah is the speaker, and yet Jehovah says, I will save them by Jehovah their God. So you have two personalities here, the speaker and the one that will save them. Now, Judah is going to be saved from Assyria, not by military means, not by military power, but by God himself. And indeed, what we saw is that when the Assyrian army did come down to Judah and surrounded Jerusalem, the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Jehovah, came and destroyed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night, forcing Sennacherib to return to the land of Assyria, to Nineveh. And you can find that story there in 2 Kings chapter 19, 32 to 36. And the angel of the Lord, remember in the Old Testament, it's always the second person of the triunity, God the Son, Jesus the Messiah. So he is Jehovah, their God, that will be the one to save Judah. Verses 8 to 9, we have a third child here, a son again, the second son, and God again chooses a name. The name shall be Lo Ami, which means not my people. And again, he himself makes the application, because for a period of time, Israel will not be God's people and Jehovah will not be their God. Now, remember this. Positionally, in accordance with the Abrahamic covenant, Israel is always the people of God, but they don't experience what it means to be the people of God when they are in disobedience. So positionally, Israel is always the people of God. And Paul actually reaffirms this for us in Romans 11, verse 1, where he says, God has not cast away his people. So experientially, experiencing the blessings of being God's people is conditioned upon obedience. So experientially, for a long time, Israel will not be God's people, but positionally, they are always God's people. So 3 children, 3 names, all applied to Israel, all negative. Jezreel, God will scatter. Lo Ruhama, God will give no mercy to them. Lo Ami, they'll not be his people. However, we're going to see that there will be a future reversal. And we see this in chapter 1, verse 10 to chapter 2, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 10, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, you are not my people, it shall be said unto them, you are the sons of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint themselves one head, and shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. And in chapter 2, verse 1, say ye unto your brethren, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhamah. So God points out that there is destined to be a future reversal and restoration. And he points out 5 things here. First of all, we see in verse 10 that there will be a national increase in population, and the name Jezreel will be reversed, because no longer will it be God scatters. In fact, it's going to have its other meaning, which is God sows. And now will Jezreel be in the same sense of God sowing, and as a result, the population of the Jewish nation will greatly increase. The second thing we see here is that also in verse 10, there will be a national conversion, a national salvation, and that will mean a twofold reversal from Lo Ami, not my people, to become Ami, my people. And secondly, Israel, who had become Lo Ami, now becomes Ami. Now, this verse is also applied to the Gentiles in Romans chapter 9, verse 24 to 26, because in that passage in Romans, Paul is saying Gentiles' salvation fulfills this verse, because contextually, Paul is not saying that Gentile salvation fulfills this verse, because contextually it refers to Israel. This, what we have here, is a literal prophecy plus application because of just this one point of similarity. At one time, the Gentiles were not his people. Now, when they become believers, they are his people. Just as Israel here is not my people, but it is destined to become my people. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10, this verse is applied specifically to Jewish believers, the remnant of Israel. Because in 1 Peter, as Jewish unbelievers, they were within the class of not my people, but now that they have become believers and part of Israel's remnant, they have become my people. So every Messianic Jew today is my people, God's people. So what we see, there's going to be a national reunification in verse 11, and the 2 houses of Israel, Judah in the south, Israel in the north, will be united. And they're going to have one head, not 2. There won't be 2 separate kings and 2 separate kingdoms. There will be one unified Jewish kingdom. So there'll be one national leadership, and the one head, and the Messiah will be that one head. And this we saw, and Hosea will bring it out further in chapter 3. King David, we're going to see in chapter 3, will be the co-regent. And he says, great shall be the day of Jezreel. And again, this primarily means here in the sense of God sowing, not scattering, God sowing. So in the day of the national sowing, great shall be the day of Jezreel. Why? Because God will sow them, and he's going to plant them in their own land. In chapter 2, verse 1, he says, say ye unto your brethren, Ami, to your sisters, Ruhamah. What they're saying is that there will be national restoration, and they'll again be God's people and again become Ami, my people. And this time they'll have mercy. So it will not be Lo Ruhamah, no mercy, but simply Ruhamah, mercy. That's his first commission. So he spelled it out, the first commission to Hosea with all the ramifications that go with it, and the marriage, the children. And he now gives a further application to Israel, who is the wife of Jehovah. And we see this in chapter 2, verses 2 to 23. In verses 2 to 5, we see the adultery of Israel. He says, contend with your mother, contend. For she is not my wife, neither am I her husband, and let her put away her whoredoms from her face and her adulteries from between her breasts. Lest I strip her naked and set her as in the day that she was born, and make her as a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. Yea, upon her children will I have no mercy, for they are children of whoredom, for their mother hath played the harlot, she that hath conceived them hath done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers that give me my bread and my water. my wool and my flax, mine oil and my drink. So here he's describing Israel's adultery, and in verse 2 he actually labels it as adultery, because she was, as a nation, the adulterous wife of Jehovah. And that resulted in a separation between God and Israel. So God now calls upon others to contend with your mother, contend. Plead my cause against her. And the result of Israel's adulteries is that she's no longer his wife and he's no longer her husband. And you can find that the statement of separation in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1. I've given you a little bit of a burst here on God's relationship between Israel as husband and wife, and they go through some specific stages of the relationship. First of all was the marriage, which was with a covenant, and that's the book of Deuteronomy is that marriage covenant between God and Israel. The second stage we're going to see quite a bit of in Hosea is that Israel is guilty of adultery. The third thing we see, which is also happening here, eventually this adultery is going to lead to separation between God and Israel. The main passage that speaks about the separation is Isaiah 50, verse 1. And the period of separation actually lasted around about 100 years. And then the fourth thing we see is that God is going to divorce Israel and give her a bill of divorcement, and that's found in Jeremiah, and that you'll find that bill of divorcement in Jeremiah. And fifth, which is the stage we're in to this day, is a period of punishment for those adulteries. And sixth, in the future, there's going to be a remarriage. So if we just keep these stages in the back of our minds, and we'll see this in Hosea particularly. Not all of them are in Hosea, but some of them are. But other prophets like Jeremiah, for instance, dealt with the same relationship. Because of this separation, he now calls upon Israel in verse 2 to put away her adultery. And the term put away is often used in the sense of putting away idolatry. We see in Genesis chapter 35, verse 2, that Jacob put away idolatry. We had Joshua, he had Israel put away idolatry in Joshua 24, verse 14. Hezekiah put away idolatry in 2 Kings 18, verse 14. And Josiah put away idolatry in 2 Kings 23, verse 19. So when he says here, put away your adulteries, he means put away your idolatry. Because the way that national Israel, the wife of Jehovah, is guilty of adultery is by means of her idolatry. Because she's having relationships with other gods. And because of her adulteries, this now leads to two results. In verse 3, the result was that Israel became lo ami, not my people. And he pictures Israel as being stripped naked. And in fact, if a wife was found to be an adulteress by her husband, he would strip her naked and send her outside naked. And that was a sign of an adulteress. And that is what God is going to do with Israel. He's going to strip her naked and send her out in a condition which now marks her out as an adulteress. She'll be as naked as when she was the day she was born, a point which is made by Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 3 to 6, which also deals with this husband and wife relationship of God and Israel. Ezekiel, I'll just give you just a verse. It just says, Ezekiel says, thou was cast out into the open field, for that thy person was abhorred in the day that thou wast born. So he's talking about the separation of husband, wife and husband. Now, the specific application to the stripping to Israel is the results he spells out in verse 3. The land becomes a wilderness, it becomes a dry land, it becomes a thirsty land. In other words, the land will become naked of any productivity, showing the land was adulterous. Second result we see in verses 4 to 5, and that is that Israel will receive lo ruhama, which is no mercy. In verse 4, there'll be no mercy upon the children. which are the individuals in the nation. And in verse 5, the reason is because of the adultery of the mother, which is a nation as a whole. And the end of verse 5, he spells out a misconception she has. Because Israel, her misconception is that these other gods she has been worshiping have been providing her with her material goods. You know, unfortunately, they believe that, you know, they gave her the bread, the wine, the water, the wool, the flax, all those things. But in actual fact, Israel has actually, at that point, actually degenerated into believing that it was these other idolatrous gods that gave her the wool, the flax, the water, the bread. She'd actually forgotten who her real provider was. And in verses 6 to 8, he now talks about the hedging of Israel. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up thy ways with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, that she shall not find her paths. And she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then was it better with me than now. For she did not know that I gave her the grain and the new wine and the oil, and multiplied unto her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So he starts out in verse 6. Therefore, this is for the very reasons of verses 2 to 5, because of her many adulteries and having become so self-deceived, she believed other gods provided those things for her. And for that reason, God will now put a hedge around her. Now, a hedge in the scriptures is usually used in a good way. We see examples in Job chapter 1, verse 10 and Job 19, verse 8. And when God begins to hedge Israel, to put a hedge around her, the result we see in verse 7 will be that she'll not be able to find those other lovers. So when God hedges Israel, those other gods will prove to be non-entities, non-existent. So they just can't find them. So that in verse 7, she'll finally see what her real need is, and her real need is to return to her first husband, Jehovah. And she finally realizes who actually is responsible for giving her these things. And then in verse 8, he again spells out the reason for her problem. She failed to see the true source of her material benefits and the gifts that her husband, Jehovah, gave her. She had the audacity to use to worship the god Baal. And this begins a key element in Hosea's prophecy, which is Israel's lack of knowledge resulting in her destruction. And he's going to bring this out multiple times. He's going to bring it in chapter 2, verse 8, in chapter 4, verse 1, and chapter 4, verse 6, chapter 5, verse 4, chapter 7, verse 9, chapter 11, verse 3. So we're going to see their lack of knowledge resulted in their destruction. For she did not know that I gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and multiplied unto her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. That's how degenerate she had become. Now, Jehovah was the one who gave her these things. She thought someone else did, and she used them to worship the god Baal. And therefore, she actually lost her knowledge of her true husband. But now the hedging around her is now going to bring her back to him. Verses 9 to 13, it describes a stripping of her productivity. Therefore, verse 9, therefore will I take back my grain in the time thereof, and my new wine in the seasons thereof, and will pluck away my wool and my flax, which should have covered her nakedness. And now will I uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feasts, her new moons, and her Sabbath, and all her solemn assemblies. And I will this is verse 12, and I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, whereof she has said, these are my hire that my lovers have given me. I'll make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. And I'll visit upon her the days of the Baalim, unto which she burned incense, when she decked herself with her earrings and her jewels and went after her lovers and forgot me, says Jehovah. This is a pretty detailed description here of how she is to be stripped. And in verse, remember, the wife who is an adulteress was stripped and put out into the wilderness. And in verse 9, we see here there's a stripping of food and clothing. Her grain will be gone, and the wool and the flax from which clothing is made, that is to be removed. Everything is to be gone. In verse 10, what's going to happen? The land becomes naked. And as an adulteress is made naked, because that is Israel's status now. She's an adulteress and she's stripped naked. In verse 11, there's going to be a cessation of all mirth and all the festive, festivals. Now those festivals he mentions here in verse 11 were actually the festivals ordained by God. Feasts, which are feasts like Passover, weeks, booths, new moons, all these things, Sabbath. These were all commanded observances under the Mosaic law. But the problem here was that what she did was she took these legitimate observances that God required, but she used them for the worship of Baal. And so with Baal, she's now guilty of committing adultery against her husband, Jehovah. And then in verse 12 is also going to be the removal of her security. The words vine and fig tree were common. These are common Old Testament symbols of security. And that's why you will see the kingdom is often described where every man will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, which is a picture of security. And in verse 12, what we see here is that the reason the vine and the fig tree is removed is because her security is removed. It's because she again made the false conclusion that when she was given these things, it was these other lovers, these other gods who gave her these things. And because of that false assumption, they're now taken away. And in place of it, in verse 13, she is to suffer the judgment upon or over or of the days of Baalim. The days of the Baalim are the days of verse 11, the days of proper feast, but used for the worship of Baal. Baalim is simply the plural for Baal. Now, because of all these activities in the worship of the Baalim, using holy days of the Mosaic law to worship the Baalim, that now caused her to forget her true husband. And the last phrase of verse 13 is a very sad note. It says, she forgot me, says Jehovah. And all this results in her forgetting her true husband. While normally the stripping of a wife and to be sent out in the public naked was simply a punishment, God's relationship to Israel is not punishment for punishment's sake. It's a discipline to try to get her to return, and eventually this kind of discipline, it will succeed. And in verses, we'll see next session, in verses 14 to 23, he deals with the future restoration of the wife, and that will be that sixth stage we mentioned earlier, when the remarriage actually comes. And that is the first session on Hosea.